What's up, guys? If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Also, please smash that like button on the video and enjoy the show.
But so let's expand more on what that site and why it's important. For those who maybe didn't listen to the last show, I study ancient Sumerian connections as almost an obsession. The ancient Sumerian original cities that were lowered in these tablets that discuss. And the last of those cities is called Shuruppak. And that's the city we talked about a little bit before in the beginning. That's the city that's supposed to be the last city that existed in this old world long ago before a catastrophe came through and wiped it out. And that's what I believe is the biblical flood. Okay? And that story is what connects this story, because the last Sumerian king was what became the biblical Noah. But he wasn't Noah at all. His original name was Untapishtim, or Ziasudra, okay? And he was a priest and a king who was part of an ancient lineage back to the original Sumerians, okay?
And what kind of year area are we talking about?
We're talking about well over 20,000 years ago. Yeah, we're going way, way, way back. We need to like clean the slate and just start over again. Oh yeah, way before that. Now imagine, just like we get the biblical narrative that tells us about Noah and the story that kind of gets silly, which is like not to every animal of every kind or anything. That's not how it's written. The original story from the flood and the biblical story comes from a set of 4 totally different sets of tablets from the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian civilizations. So imagine a story that was so important. It was like one of our benchmarks that made us who we are, and all these things came out of that. Imagine civilizations, that story is so important that even thousands of years later, the other civilizations that come along write the same story to carry it on over and over and over again. And imagine you find not only the later versions, but the original version.
Do we have anything archaeologically that can back that up, though?
We do now. We do now, and we
I have to. I mean, before we go to that though, I have to be fair and give the same criticism I give of all the Bible stuff.
Absolutely.
And again, there are some things that are absolutely supported by archaeology and stuff like that. But humans change stories, right? And they may change in small ways, but if you play Whisper Down the Lane with 20 people and tell a story in someone's ear, by the time it gets to the 20th person, it's 85% what it was at the beginning.
Totally understand. But now imagine, though, if you have sets of ancient tablets, cuneiform tablets from these civilizations, and they were all in the same place because of a man named Ashurbanipal, who's an ancient king and priest that went out and amassed them into that library we discussed, right? Brought them all together. That's how we found them. But imagine if all those tablets describe a story and they all have the same parallels to the story. So then you say, okay, so there's some credibility there with that story, right? You see all the parallels. You take and you cross-reference every single parallel and then put it together. There's your story, right? You say like, well, this is crossing over to this. They align. You take all their multiple avenues that align too. That's how you start formulating what it might be. But like you said, that's not enough archaeological evidence to prove a time frame. Take the kings list that they had, the Sumerian king list, the Uruk list of kings and sages, the Baroshes king list. Then you take the Egyptian kings list from the Turan list of kings from Egypt, and you go to that as well as some of the ancient biblical texts like the Book of Enoch, and you get these weird correlations. They all talk about like these ancient lineages of kings that ruled for a long time, right? And how long they lived for. And if you can take that for a moment in a grain of salt and say, well, I don't know if I trust this one, but what if you take all of them and you combine them together just like that? You take the ages, you take the reigns, you take the locations, and you get a certain time period, right? You get something that's like over 50,000 years old. And it's like, at first you like totally reject. You're like, no way. That's got to be something wrong with that, right? That's where we were. That's where we were before, because the problem is you can't date stone. So you get all these giant megaliths around the world, and like people like Graham Hancock and Randall and others, were coming along. We're like, well, I believe based on the evidence that these were built far longer and are a lot older than we're told, right? But how long ago? See, that's where it gets challenging, because how do you date if you have no organic matter? You use catastrophes.
How does that help you date?
You use catastrophes to date time periods For instance, you can take
Time
ice.
periods,
You can take ice cores. I'll give you an example.
Okay.
You can take ice cores, like say from Greenland, and you get a snapshot of 20,000 years max, because the Greenland ice sheet isn't necessarily, most of it isn't older than that. So you get about a 20,000 year window, which is pretty awesome, right? If you go to Antarctica, you can get a 500,000 year window because the ice there is a lot more ancient. Okay, what do you do with that? Well, let's say you just, for the purposes of being smaller, let's not try to get as big as the Antarctic ones, but let's just take the Greenland ice cores for a minute. You can look at that ice core and look at where there are bubbles and areas of like ash and things that have accumulated within that ice, and it gives you a snapshot of what happened in the past. It's like a little viewpoint on what happened on the Earth at that time. Some of these ice cores, like I said, you'll have a layer where you might have some microscopic ash that's accumulated all in a certain spot, or extreme warming. And the way you would tell that is you would see bubbles of carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is always the precursor to a warming climate, always. And that's what you see in ice cores around the world, is that carbon dioxide levels always spike before temperatures do on the planet, showing us that it likely has nothing to do with human activity at all, because if you look at historical time periods, you get massive volcanoes going off, methane melting from permafrost, you already have the means to create catastrophic warming in those types of ways, right? Well, when we look at those ice cores, we find that there is a cyclical nature to the climate of Earth. Cyclical. It goes through these very, very defined periods where it goes warm, and then it goes really cold for a while, and then you get this interglacial period, which means in between the glacials periods, and you get catastrophes nearly every time. Randall talks about this all the time, Randall Carlson. You look at something, for instance, you look at the megafauna graveyards across the northern hemisphere in Alaska and Siberia, and you can see millions of mammoths froze to death and died like instantly out of nowhere, right? So you take those things, and then you say something like, well, what are the tablets talking about? They're talking about some kind of a massive event. Massive event. Not regionalized, though, because also, wait, this culture in South America or Mexico is talking about it too. Or how about, like, there's more than 1,000 stories in ancient cultures around the world, even indigenous cultures that aren't like advanced, of ancient floods, but not in a nature of like it rains a lot and something comes through their area, of ancestral stories, not from their memory, ancestral stories from long ago of events that almost wiped us out so we weren't here anymore. That's the kind of things we're talking about, okay? So for a minute, take out the little stuff, not the little events like the medieval warming, right? If you look at ice cores, you'll see that during medieval periods, there was actually a series of years that were warmer than we are now. During medieval times, it's called the medieval warming.
When was that approximately?
That was 400 years ago or something? I don't know right off my head. I'd have to look at that.
Yeah, can you look that up, Alessi? Medieval warming?
Now, what people don't know is that there is a period called the Younger Dryas, but there's also an Older Dryas and then an Oldest Dryas.
Oh, they call them all the same thing.
Right. And what it means is that when the Earth went through its interglacial cycle on the last time.
By the way, 950 to 1250.
Okay, yeah, a little older than I thought. Okay, a little older than I thought. Now, imagine, what was I just saying? I lost my train of thought there.
When the Earth was at something at the same time. I was looking at the screen.
Imagine you take these time periods of interglacial, and you recognize that interglacial periods come with disasters, right? You're a climate scientist. You look at how when the period of when the glaciers start receding, and then you get this period where we get into a warmer time, which right now it's called the Holocene, okay? That period of time, which is about 1,500 years on average, when we look at ice cores, you get catastrophes across the Earth. Not for a consistent 1,500, but like maybe every couple hundred years, or especially like a big one on the front end and then a very big one on the back end, right? Events. Now imagine that there have been more than one of those, though. And we know that because when Solon traveled down to talk to the temple priests of Sais that we talked about in Egypt, we told them about the story of Atlantis, remember? They say, you Greeks remember one deluge only, Solon they're talking to. But there have been many primarily of fire and water.
Yes.
All right. So they're talking about how there have been events with like volcanoes and plates maybe moving with all this stuff, and also tsunamis and floods. Let's for a minute just disregard a regional event. I understand scientists and academics were like, well, in their world back then, they only knew a certain area. So for them, if an event occurred, it was worldwide because their viewpoint was small, right? That's the argument. What if that's not true? What if there have been catastrophes on the Earth that have affected the Earth in different ways, okay? Not like annihilating life all over the planet or anything, but affecting the Earth in different ways. And some of the areas that got affected extremely significantly were the areas that these lost civilizations were living.
And are those areas that were significantly affected very often underwater now?
Underwater, or they've had massive tectonic changes. Let me give you an example. Outside of Ollantaytambo and Saskatchewan, outside of Saskatchewan and Ollantaytambo, we find these very, very bizarre ruins of staircases carved into these massive rock.
Yeah, watch the camera there. You're
massive amounts of rock, okay? And the stairs are upside down. Okay, the rock that they built on in these boulders outside of Ollantaytambo and Saskatchewan is like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tons, okay? And I'm not saying they moved the stone. What I'm trying to say is the staircase is upside down on it, okay? It looks like that massive stone, as big as like this building, was toppled. Okay, if that makes sense. Was like literally thrown upside down, and now the staircase is on the wrong side. What kind of catastrophe or tsunami could move like a 200-ton rock and flip it like nothing? That's the kind of catastrophes we're talking about.
Yeah, something wicked.
Civilizations like Lake Titicaca that we're going to talk about that are over 12,000 feet had tsunamis high enough, I believe, to wipe them all out.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. Please hit that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.